Good morning, everyone. Dan, thanks for that generous introduction. I'm very selfish. I follow my DGA family everywhere, and I know good things are going to come eventually. And congratulations to the Year of Morocco faculty learning community. Welcome again, my colleagues from Morocco. I've never traveled to Morocco, but I know some things about it, largely because of my friend sitting in the audience today. Um, well, it's kind of hard to follow the Dean's Act here, so I'll try to make it short. But to introduce someone as illustrious as Dr. Skalli is not easy. So thanks for joining us. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Skalli speaking on a topic that's very close to her heart. And her insights, I believe, will shape a lot of our conversations in the next 2 days and beyond. Dr. Skalli is here today, but those of us who've been working on grants for the Year of Morocco have been reading her work and enjoying it on paper. And now we get to hear from her and engage with her, hopefully. You all may have Googled Dr. Skalli. That's very common these days, and there's a big introduction for her in the handout. So I will not, belabor her accomplishments, but I'll take a slightly personal route. I met Dr. Skalli as a young assistant professor right out of graduate school 10 years ago in American University, where we were colleagues. Not only did she inspire me with her astounding and nuanced scholarship on the MENA region, she shaped my thinking about critical issues of our time: gender and development, youth movements, media studies, contemporary cultural studies, generational dynamics among women politicians, the Arab Spring and its aftermath, and so much more. Her work has been foundational for me in thinking through how to write about the Global South as a scholar from the Global South now living in the American academe. Dr. Skalli and I started our journeys in academics in our own countries, but our paths crossed in the United States of America, and that's a beautiful thing about the United States. It exposes you to people who you would have never met before. Dr. Skalli does not talk about interdisciplinarity. She does interdisciplinarity. She got her PhD in an interdisciplinary field from Penn State, and before joining the US academe, she had an accomplished academic career in Morocco between 1987 and 2002. At the moment, she teaches at the University of California in Washington, D.C. campus, and she is also, among her many publications, she also edits a series on gender and activism with Lexington Books. So if you all want to talk business with her, I'm sure she'll appreciate it. Her current publications center on two important topics of our time: gender-based violence in North Africa and gender memory and memorialization in MENA after the Arab Spring. I could go on about Dr. Skalli. She's a friend, my immigrant sister, mentor, and scholar par excellence. Please welcome Dr. Skalli to Kennesaw State University.
I love to be in the company of the great people, and I'm so honored that I am in the company of friends I know, friends from Morocco, friends I will make, and all the wonderful developments coming from these friendships. Let me first start by thanking the university for this incredible honor to be with you and for creating this amazing forum for discussion about important, timely, pertinent, but also vexing issues. I'd like in particular to thank Dr. Lance Askildsen, the Vice Provost for Global Affairs. What you've been doing is incredible. And it's, again, as my friend and colleague said, Debarati, it is not talking about cross-cultural, intercultural, it's doing. the cross-cultural and the intercultural. I'd like to thank the Dean from Casablanca, Dr. Abdul Qadir. Forgive me for mispronouncing your name, Gunigi, Gunigai, for, again, being a leader in bridging interests and passions about Morocco, issues of Morocco across the continent. And special thanks to Dr. Daniel Paraka. I've abused your patience, and I apologize. We've been emailing back and forth for over a year, but he got from me the taste of how Moroccans communicate. Very slow, despite the internet. I'd like to thank each and every member of the organizing committee of this conference. I know it's tremendous work, and I applaud the focus you've given to this conference. Thank you, and I am very much looking forward to a very productive conversation these coming 2 days. And I thank all the students and volunteers who we don't unfortunately mention by names, but we know they are the foot soldiers. So thank you very much for all the work in making this conference possible. So a conference such as this is very interesting on many levels, professional, but also personal. It's the year of Morocco. It's bringing back memories. It's making us think back, think about the present, contemplate the future. And it is a fantastic Morocco, as Dean Lenz mentioned, is complex, fascinating in its complexity. And it's absolutely a land of tremendous potential, but baffling contradictions. And that's what we love as social scientists. So Morocco is really our dream laboratory for research. We like to ask complex questions, and we're on the ground to find complex, nuanced issues. And I'm sure Dr. Lance introduced the word complexity. We're going to be hearing a lot about complexities for the following 2 days. So let me start by sharing with you some memories from my land. Growing up in Morocco, I was born in a small town in Kenitra, then moved on, and my formative years were in another small town, El Jadida. And one of my role models was my grandmother. Illiterate, very dignified, extremely wise, and a fascinating storyteller. And that's where I would spend weekends with her. She was in Casablanca. Sometimes when I could, my parents would take me. On one of those visits, she told me about her subversive stories growing up in the Medina of Fez. In the 50s, she would wear jalabas with her sisters, wear her husband's jalabas, cover her face, and go to restaurants. It wasn't the food that was delicious, it was tasting the forbidden at the time of being out in the public space. So one of those trips, she actually took me with her to the beach, Mohammedia. For the young girl I was at the time, growing up in a religious, conservative family, the trip was intoxicating with the freedoms that she was opening up for me. Not only did we, as two, women from Morocco, not only did we take the bus on our own, but we also went to the beach where she had no hesitation in wearing her bathing suit and sitting with me very dignified. And before I knew it, she had a cigarette in her hand. Not that she was a smoker. So I looked at that moment in my young mind, and it was like the world was my oyster. I was going to be like her. I was going to be free. I was going to do whatever I wanted. And it really meshed well with growing up with a father who believed tremendously in girls' education. believed tremendously in our education before marriage. Quite unusual. But I grew up hearing him referring to hadith, contested the origin of the hadith, but nonetheless, seek knowledge even if you have to go to China. I didn't go to China. I went to Rabat for my college. And I didn't realize what the price would be of going from a small town to Rabat, living on my own, and having friends, and trying to be a respectful student. And I'm using the term respectful, inverted commas. But what is interesting is that after the trip with my grandmother, I was walking the street with my sister, and I was harassed by an older man. For the eyes of a 12-year-old, he looked senile. And despite all the warnings of don't talk, don't answer back, I couldn't help but say, Shuma, shame on you. Could be your daughter or granddaughter. For those words, I got slapped many times on the street. And it started chattering my dream with my grandmother. And when I went back to Rabat to study, it was a high price to pay because the neighbors wouldn't talk to me. Parents of my friends were very concerned that I was living alone. What kind of morals would I be sharing? So I had to prove that I was a good girl. And then in college, I got a fantastic education. I truly did, from very dedicated professors. But I also got another education written nowhere in the books, but very, very important in my identity formation. And it was basically, don't do politics. You gotta be safe. Don't get involved, don't get engaged. Politics is a very dangerous game. So these stories are not about tales of victimhood. I had a wonderful childhood and I had a wonderful time growing up in Morocco, despite everything else. But these are stories about the kinds of Morocco of extreme potential and incredible contradictions. For a young girl at the time, there are many things I could not reconcile, and I had lots of questions. And the father who supported me for education, nonetheless, did not know what to do with me once I was educated and called me a feminist, which at the time, coming from him, was an insult. How dare you discuss issues of equality? So it was like, education for what? So this is my way of looking at how identities are formed, and obviously, the younger generation today, and many of you will be saying, well, that was then, that's Morocco then, Morocco today is different, and I agree. The depth, direction, and the dimension of change is something we will agree on and discuss during these 2 days. But what I am interested in is raising these contradictions in how young men or young women, these contradictions that actually shape, inform their decisions, their choices, the way they look at themselves, the way they ask questions about power, questions about gender roles and expectations, questions about institutions that they are, interacting with. And so in terms of contradiction paradoxes, please consider the following few facts. Education in Morocco, education for women, we've achieved incredible milestones. We've made tremendous strides since the time I'm talking about. Our colleges are filled with female students and graduates. And yet, Morocco, like many Middle Eastern countries, still suffers from what we call the gender paradox. We educate women, but we don't see a lot of young women in the job market. They are the first to suffer from high unemployment and high underemployment, taking up jobs in the most precarious and vulnerable of positions. Consider this. Religious and political apparatuses in the country strictly police and control girls' bodies and sexuality. And yet, recent reports tell us that the practice of abortion, illicit, hidden behind doors, is rampant and averages something like 600 cases a day. It is a reality that we are dealing with. And consider this, that women occupy in Morocco some of the most incredible leadership positions in virtually all spheres. And yet our streets are not necessarily the safest. They are still masculine streets, predominantly. And then consider this. It is true that among many of the Middle Eastern countries and North African countries, we have one of the most vibrant media landscape, a relatively greater freedom of expression, and we have developed something like the culture of protest. So many movements, so many incredible initiatives happening. But at the same time, we still have censorship of journalists, jailing for free speech. We still have uncertainty about the cost of freedom, and we still have activists being penalized for words or work they're doing. So it is in this sense that I find our discussion would make sense of this world by talking about the paradigm of complexity, which I am borrowing from Edgar Morin. It is a paradigm of complexity where we need to identify and address the tensions, contradictions, ruptures in the system. And we have to be able to put these in the context of Morocco within the broader neoliberal globalization facilitated by information technologies, as it interacts with national policies, with local traditions of loyalties and networks, and then ask questions about what all of this means for young people, young women, and young men, their gendered, class, sexualized, ethnicized identities. So here is what I propose. I propose a series of questions that we can reflect on, and that could probably, I don't promise I will answer all of them, but questions that I find interesting that could help our discussion during the following 2 days. Since our social movements and protests and streets have increasingly acquired a young face, young women and young men, the following questions become pertinent. So if Morocco has developed a culture, as I said, of protest with a young face, then what kind of problems do the young people politicize? Do they express these issues as political action or as collective demands? What are the consequences of their actions as young women and as young men? What are the consequences on their personal lives, on their communities, and also in terms of citizenship terms? How do young people in Morocco become citizens in conditions of limited opportunities? What are the pathways? What are the pathways for women? What are the pathways for men? And this is an important question, obviously, because the scripts of young people's lives are marked by unfinished biographic transitions. Transition from school to work is not smooth, it is ruptured. And transition to citizenhood, likewise. Given the high cost of political action and freedom of speech, is it possible to be a citizen without politics and have a political voice? Where do technologies of communication and information, and where do social media figure in all of these? And how do technologies, how do digital technologies interact with traditional modes of communication? From singing, to dancing, to theater, to performance in different spaces, to networks person to person and one to the many. What connections are there between the articulations of their generational demands and the advancement of democracy in Morocco? Finally, what kind of democratic governance can young men and women expect, dream about, and look forward to? Now, I propose a framework in which we can begin to discuss some of these questions. Like most social scientists, we're good at asking questions. I'm not sure we're good at answering them all the time, or answering all of them at least. So the framework I propose obviously takes into consideration globalization, local forces, the interactions between them, the global meso level and the local level. And I'm looking at this framework because it problematizes three important notions that we work with that we need to question if we adopt, if we are focusing as we are on young people in the country. The first is the problematization of citizenship. And I know it's an abused term, but forgive me, I still have to work with it. So it is citizenship and the re-articulation of the post-colonial neoliberal subjectivities. The second is activism. That's the second term that is problematized. Activism and the restructuring of contention and the grammar of protest. Third, communication and culture. Communications and cultures, plural, and the reconfiguration of processes of information flows and knowledge production. And because gender matters, and because class matters, as does ethnicity, geographic location, and sexuality, then we have no choice but to adopt what we already have heard from Dr. Lance, intersectionality, in our answers to this question. So, how am I doing on time?
Pretty good.
Okay, thank you. So, a few thoughts about globalization and the post-coloniality of subjectivities before I move on to my three terms. As we know, globalization stands in opposition to post-coloniality. Globalization is about marketing economies, and it is about the expansion of the capital logic of exploitation, but also the naturalization of that process. Post-colonialism articulates the politics of resistance and equality and seeks to actually lay bare those processes of exploitation. What does that mean for Morocco, for the Moroccan generation? Well, what it means is that in the 50s and 70s, from the 50s, post-independence, the development policies and the nationalist ideology were supported by ideas that promoted a middle class and promoted the dreams of the middle class in terms of providing education, employment, security of some sort. The neoliberal reforms since the 80s complicated that relationship and eroded the power and capability of the state to provide those services, which translate, of course I'm simplifying, into the unemployment and temporary employment of masses of young men and women to whom education meant social mobility and meant an identity to get a job and fulfill some of the expectations, at least, of masculinity or the hegemonic masculinity in terms of providing materially. But as we all know, globalization has also altered that social contract of what the state provides and what citizens expect. So the initial consequences is what we talked about for quite a while, about the alienated generation, disenfranchised, economically insecure, and underrepresented in politics. But globalization is not just about liberalization and the market economies and the restructuring of other institutions. It is about the change in the constitution of experience, subjectivities and consciousness, and the structuring of feelings and positions towards a number of institutions. In simple terms, the younger generation today, with the entrenched globalization policies, the younger generation live, forge, form, negotiate their identities in a series of ruptures, dissonances, and hopes postponed. Therefore, narratives of failure and shame have become common. I cannot find a job. I cannot get married. I cannot provide for my families. They invested in my education. I cannot return that investment. It is identities developed in a number of narratives of insufficiency and failure. For young women, the narratives were similar but more complicated given the gender. And of course, the narratives are more complicated with the class and with other social markers. But for young women, what it meant is the expectation to see education becoming the tool for greater freedom, for greater affirmation of what they wanted to do, and greater choices in life, typically career, marriage, age of marriage, and partners. So what I'm saying here is that globalization has exacerbated what we already know about the post-colonial construction of identities. It has exacerbated uncertainties, belonging, the sense of belonging. It has exacerbated questions about cultural and religious anchoring of the identity, affiliations, gender roles, loyalties. And this is where the first concept I'm going to talk about is about citizenship. The question is, how do young people construct that citizenship within this environment? And so here, I am not going to belabor on the myriad ways in which citizenship has been defined, debated, contested. I'll share with you just a few of the terms that I find useful in our discussion about the young generation, young men and women. And the first thing I'll start with is that given the interaction between the global-local mediated by the national, citizenship is taking place in contested contexts, and citizenship is formed within competing discourses, competing visions. What do I mean by this? So I already mentioned that young people form their citizenship in terms of exclusions and marginalization. But that is happening on a long legacy of the state imposing a vision of citizenship that we refer to as disciplinary and dutiful citizenship. Although it sounds liberal in terms of rights and responsibilities, in the post-colonial times, it was more of a disciplinary citizenship. That is complicated more with the current king, Mohammed VI. Given the reforms and restructuring of a number of institutions, religious, political, cultural, and social, we hear about a different kind of citizenship. Effective citizenship is the term that we find in discourses, in his discours and speeches. Now, those terms exist along with other forms and other expectations, definitions of citizenship circulated by supranational organizations, conventions, supranational organizations like international organizations and human rights groups. And here we see other pictures talking about citizenship in terms of diversity and inclusiveness. And for a moment, I'm asking you to imagine we are all young, still struggling with the anxieties of constituting our identities. And among the circulation of discourses and images and definitions of citizenship, we have a very appealing one, cultural citizenship, which is defined by many scholars as the emphasis on cultural rights that transcend normative definitions of citizenship as a legal status, of entitlement on grounds in the cultural practices of everyday life. In other terms, it is a citizenship that emphasizes not only equality, but the recognition of diversity. In cultural terms, in linguistic terms, in sexual or sexual identity terms. Interestingly, after the movement, February 20th, the youth-led movement, February 20th, the new constitution defines citizenship, hitting practically all of these definitions. And so Moroccanness, or rather, effective citizenship, is defined in terms of diversity, plurality, in its Islamic, Arab, Amazigh, Sahara Hassani, African, Jewish, and Mediterranean components. It's incredible. After all, citizenship is a useful term. The question, and I'm moving to my second concept, is how does diversity and plurality, how does this diversity inform and shape the identities, subjectivities, and decisions of young people? And here I need to make a quick stop and tell you about my frequent trips to Morocco for research, of course, and food and family. In 2008, like most researchers, I had read enough about the young generation of Moroccans being apolitical, disaffected, cynical, and I wanted to understand a little bit more about that. So my first mistake was to go from here back to Morocco with a set of assumptions and tools that did not question what the surveys were telling me. And so I started the interviews with the youth sections of political parties, unions, NGOs, and I couldn't find young people. And those who called themselves young were in their 40s and 50s, and I'm kidding you not. They were in the youth cells of political parties. And so I had a very wise activist who's been on the terrain for a long time, and he told me, you are looking in the wrong places. Young people are not here. You want to understand in youth politics? Go to the streets. Go to festivals. Go to cafes. Go to various places. If you want to hear hard rock, whether you like it or not, it has something to tell you. If you want to understand, if you like or not like hip hop, and other street arts and performances, go. That's where you should be, and that's where I went. So that was a very humbling lesson of social scientists equipping themselves with terms that we forget to question at times. And so what I found, indeed, since 2008, was that the tools we're working with are outmoded, and political party affiliation is interesting for young people for the wrong reasons I was looking at. It was interesting because it provided social capital. You connect with parties for some kind of mobility. You could find a job, you could be promoted, and I'm not saying this in an inefficacious way, because what globalization is doing is creating that sense of entrepreneurship in the young generation. You have, and they absorbed the whole principle of individualism and entrepreneurship, so you have to find opportunities. And so what I'm sharing with you now are some of the movements that are really fascinating and making the landscape in Morocco vibrant with protest, with the presence of young people. And I know that the movements I'm going to mention are not all led by young people, but many of them have significant participation of young people. If not, they actually have a younger generation that is redefining some of the older claims and actually putting more pressing demands on the table. And I'm starting with February the 20th, very briefly. I know that there will be a fascinating presentation later on, but I'm mentioning it for the following reasons. That the young people that I found in February 20th in 2011, many of whom I had actually met prior to the formation of February 20th. I had met them in some of the spaces and the arenas that I was talking about, some of them cultural, some of them, centers, some of them, alternative spaces that young people had created to come together. And in that sense, I was not surprised that February the 20th was mostly based on unaffiliated political parties. And I was not surprised that they revealed through February the 20th the attempt to be horizontal in leadership, to be inclusive linguistically, to promote the derija, as I had heard in many cultural events. The Moroccan Arabic had more value. It was used, it was given another political, social, and cultural meaning that was very much linked to a sense of belonging, but also as a tool of political protest. I do not connect with the political class using unofficial media, not in standard Arabic. I communicate in Darija, I communicate in Amazigh, one of the Amazigh languages, and therefore that's how we are. And I also was very impressed by the system of governance, the way the organization was bringing itself together, using digital technologies in a very smart way, using social media, but, and it's a big but here, those technologies had meaning only when there was protest on the ground. So I am not going to glorify the media and talk about the Facebook generation. It misses the point. It really is the ground, online and offline, that made sense. And I will reflect, like I said, we'll talk about this movement later on. And I'm transitioning to the next movement very quickly, and that is the Amazigh movement for inclusiveness. Nothing new, created well before the young generation I am talking about. But what is interesting is that this younger generation is more interested in localizing issues. although there are transnational linkages with the rights of indigenous people, there are many linkages, and they are part of many of those supranational national organizations we're talking about. The younger generations are interested in the practices of everyday lives, in what makes meaning to them. And what makes meaning is the language they speak. Hence, they pushed for the language, the Amazigh, to be recognized officially. And actually, it was a point of discussion prior to Muhammad VI, but they made it very urgent. It was about education. It was about the right to be and exercise and express one's culture. And also, interestingly, an area that is pretty much understudied, it is the right of the Berber woman. The Berber woman who's been carrying, like many other women around the world, the burden of being the guardian of tradition. While it is an honorable responsibility, it comes with a price. That women have to reproduce inequalities, and they have to reproduce the patriarchies that confine and constrain their lives. And so we are seeing that with the younger generation. And then I want to touch on very quickly, again, another movement which is not necessarily led by young people, but certainly intergenerational. And that is the rural women's movement for the equality in land reform. I was going to present on that years ago. Fascinating for a number of reasons. Started 10 years ago. And it is a first in the land where actually movements are coming from off-center. The rural, class matters again, and intergenerational dynamics. And it is a fight about not only the ownership of land, but also the recognition that there are inequalities in the use of the land. And we see very interesting dynamics, again, that have produced some of the recent positive results for the movement of the Sulaliyat. Then I move into another recent movement, the Hirak Shabi movement in the north. And here, it's about socioeconomic grievances coming on top of legacies of decades of exclusion and experience of citizenship in terms of exclusion economically and socially. And I'm almost tempted to use here, borrow a term from Huston, who talks about insurgent citizenship. It is very appropriate, and it allows us to understand the dynamics happening up north. And then I will end with, but this is not the end of the list. I just cannot afford to go in details. I want to reflect on what it means to be a young woman in the current environment, discursive as well as policy environment and religious environment of being a woman, talking about rights, talking about gender equality, and talking about sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And I think we will have in the Q&A opportunity to talk more about what is so unique about this young generation of self-defined feminists. They have important issues that they're pushing. Again, issues that are not new, but they are pushing with more persistence and almost unconditional negotiations. And that is making the streets safe for women. So the issue of sexual harassment has always been there with established women's organizations, secular and religious talk about it. But the younger generation is not very interested in policies that do not translate into how they live their lives on a daily basis. They are not interested in policies that really take into consideration what it means to walk the streets of Morocco and experience microaggressions on a daily basis. And again, the achievements at these levels are interesting. With the passing of the recent criminalization of sexual harassment on the streets of Morocco, first step, not the end of the story. So what do all of these movements tell us again about the terms of citizenships and the kinds of activism that have been trying to articulate this movement? What this means, and some of the commonalities in the movements I've talked about, is that there is a sense of urgency and immediacy with the younger generation. This idea, this discourse, this vision of youth, you are the future leaders, does not resonate with the younger generation. And I've heard it times and again. They will tell you, we live today, our daily lives, so things are important now. Citizenship has always been at the heart of women's struggles around the world, so women's movements are very familiar with the struggles, to be socially, economically, and politically included. But what the movements are doing, they are problematizing citizenship in its cultural, economic, political, religious, and legal terms. And for me, what is fascinating is that the younger generation are problematizing the way we are approaching young people in our research. We have this temptation to talk about youth as being either included or excluded, as being engaged or disengaged. They have problematized that binary by demonstrating again and again that their politics occur in the interstices of the inclusion and exclusion, that they are carving up spaces that we haven't been paying attention to. Hence, suddenly, we are discovering that culture matters, that communications matter. And that's where the politics are really interesting. And with the kinds of movements I'm referring to, again, another test to liberal theories of social movements, that it's about political, opportunity structure. That's when people gain their rights. I think that young people are about structures of fear and structures of dispossession. That's how they actually mobilize. It isn't just about inclusion, exclusion, and waiting for political movements. And therefore, I invite us to reflect on the existence of a multiplicity of counter-hegemonic public spheres and spaces and arenas of contestations that exist. Secular, religious, generational, gendered class, but also intergenerational in their dynamics. And this is taking me to the last point that globalization and localization have problematized, and that is communication and cultures and the reconfiguration of knowledge production and information flows. Chantal Mouffe tells us that for culture and art to make meaningful political disruptive, or to create meaningful disruptive moments, art and cultures have to be, what is needed, she says, quote, is widening the field of artistic intervention by intervening directly in a multiplicity of social spaces in order to oppose the program of total social mobilization of capitalism. The cultural, artistic, and media scenes in Morocco are absolutely fascinating to partake in, to study, to watch, to try to understand. There is just an explosion of potentialities. So let me say just a few words here, because I know, again, colleagues and friends will be reflecting on all of these. In terms of digital technologies and social media, think about this. In 2000, there were about 100,000 internet users in Morocco. In 2016, 20 million internet users. And I agree, there is a digital divide, again, by gender and class and geographic location. But we have to talk about telephony as well. And we have to talk about the intergenerational use of digital technologies to mediate and articulate the ideas and aspirations and frustrations and grievances of the older generation that are not necessarily tech savvy. The Sulaliyat work with younger, urban-based, young and not so young, tech-savvy people to air their demands. I find that fascinating. But I also have seen an evolution in what digital technologies and social media mean for young people in the formation of their identities and in a sense, in giving value to who they are despite the series of marginalities that they are experiencing. So the internet, first of all, opened up a whole world. Fantastic, I'm moving towards the conclusion. The internet opened up a whole world of alternative ways of living, being, and belonging. So I would say the journey initially was just about knowing what's outside and beyond Morocco. And then blogs became really important. Microbiographies, creating spaces of reflecting on the self, reflecting and communicating with the other, and understanding a little bit about something that doesn't happen very often despite all the discussion about gender dynamics in Morocco. At the end of the day, young men and women don't know each other. They don't communicate that much. And there is a possibility created without fetishizing technologies of, having a conversation in different ways. And then, of course, from experimenting with blogs and acquiring technological literacy and competence and confidence, we've started seeing more and more young people becoming content generators. And that content is subversive, interesting, directly in dialogue with globalization, dialogue with the national and international institutions, and a tool for mobilization. In terms of the cultural scenes and youth cultures, again, I am not going to dwell too much given the time constraint, but I can say the following. Look everywhere. Theater of the oppressed, look at the cinematic productions, novels, what have you. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And something that is interesting here is that we are seeing more and more attempts at pushing the boundaries. We all know in Morocco, and scholars of Morocco know what the red line is. And typically, you do not talk about the figure of the king, you do not talk about religion, and you do not talk about sexuality. Are these the three? I'm sure I'm missing something. But I find the cultural scene very much playing with those spaces in very complicated and interesting way. Where does that take us and where does it leave us as I move to my conclusion? Indeed, Morocco is a land of tremendous potential and baffling paradoxes. And indeed, globalization creates in its interaction with localities. It creates possibilities, conditions for exclusions, but also possibilities for being subversive, given the technologies that bypass national apparatuses of surveillance. So a recent survey, 2016, that reports on the results of discussion with 1,022 young men and women, reports the following: that young people after 2011 and after the change in the Constitution and all of the incredible efforts on the ground, young people still feel systematically undervalued, unappreciated, and still with a loss of faith in public actors and leadership and political discourses. Interestingly, at the same time, young people are very interested in politics, and I'm quoting, but they do not like the rules of the political game. And we also find from the research, and I touched on this very briefly, an interest by the younger generation to ascribe to broader struggles for democracy and rights. So young feminists, and I sort of discussed this in a different research paper, young feminists complicate their self-identification, but also would rather ascribe to the struggle for human rights than specifically talk about feminisms. And finally, we are seeing also interesting mobilizations in the cyber sphere and other cultural spaces about LGBTI rights. What is this? This is telling us, from this survey, and I'm concluding with a few points. A, we are witnessing a deepening of the question of social justice across classes, geographic locations, generations, etc. We are also noticing that new forms of citizenry are emerging that think differently and boldly about power, institutional alignments, identity formations, loyalties, and engagement. And finally, I believe that the challenge today for Moroccan leadership is to tap into this incredible potential if we are serious in talking about this business of democracy. Thank you.